Seattle, Washington, August 13, 2023. Dominic Cooper, a 45-year-old high-ranking corporate executive, was found dead in his luxury hotel room under mysterious circumstances. What was first assumed to be an accidental death quickly took a darker turn as investigators uncovered troubling inconsistencies. As authorities delved deeper into his life, they revealed a web of obsession, betrayal, and hidden motives that sent shockwaves through the city's elite circles and left the community reeling. Dominic Cooper appeared to have it all. As a high-powered corporate vice president at a prestigious investment firm, he was known for his sharp mind, undeniable charisma, and relentless work ethic. His life was the kind that inspired envy. A sprawling home in an affluent neighborhood, luxury cars parked in the driveway, and a picture-perfect marriage to his wife, Elise. To the outside world, Dominic and Elise embodied success, the ideal couple living a life most could only dream of. Friends and colleagues often spoke highly of Dominic. He was the man who could command attention in a boardroom and charm his way through any social event. At company functions, he was always impeccably dressed, flashing a confident smile as he made rounds, shaking hands and effortlessly engaging in conversation. His reputation extended beyond just his professional achievements. He was seen as a devoted husband, always speaking fondly of Elise and their life together. But beneath the polished surface, cracks were beginning to show. Dominic's demanding career meant long hours, endless meetings, and frequent business trips that kept him away from home more often than not. His commitment to his work had once been a point of pride for Elise, who admired his ambition and drive. Over time, however, the distance it created between them became undeniable. Dinners were often eaten alone, phone calls went unanswered, and late nights at the office became routine. Elise, always the supportive wife, put on a brave face in public, but those closest to her sensed a growing loneliness that she rarely spoke about. Their home, a luxurious estate with pristine landscaping and tasteful decor, no longer felt warm. It was a showcase of their wealth, but behind the grand facade, Elise spent most evenings in solitude, with only the hum of the television to keep her company. Dominic's absence had become something she had learned to accept, but acceptance didn't make it any easier. As time passed, whispers of trouble in the marriage began to circulate, though neither Dominic nor Elise acknowledged them. In social circles, the hushed gossip hinted at the possibility that Dominic's dedication to his career wasn't the only thing keeping him away from home. It started with subtle observations, too many late-night meetings, lingering glances exchanged at corporate events, and Dominic's increasing closeness with his assistant, Megan Clark. Megan was young, ambitious, and always by Dominic's side. She handled his schedule, traveled with him on business trips, and knew his life inside and out. To many, their relationship seemed purely professional, but others weren't so sure. Elise had heard the rumors, dismissing them at first as baseless speculation fueled by jealousy. But deep down, a nagging feeling gnawed at her. She could recall moments when she questioned things. Unanswered texts, Dominic returning home smelling of a perfume that wasn't hers, and the way he seemed distant even when he was physically present. Elise wanted to believe in the life they had built together, but something felt off, something she couldn't quite put her finger on. Despite her growing doubts, Elise maintained an outward appearance of perfection. She continued attending charity events, hosting dinner parties, and smiling through the discomfort of lingering stares and whispered conversations. Her social calendar remained full, and she expertly deflected questions about Dominic's frequent absences with a practiced ease that had become second nature. Meanwhile, Dominic continued to climb the corporate ladder, his focus solely on advancing his career. His charm and confidence masked the stress that came with his position, but those who worked closely with him noticed subtle changes. He was more irritable, short-tempered at times, and increasingly protective of his phone. Colleagues whispered about his long meetings behind closed doors with Megan, and some claimed they had seen the two together outside of work in moments that seemed too intimate for a simple professional relationship. Megan herself was no stranger to the gossip. She had heard the rumors and knew the assumptions people were making, but she never confirmed nor denied them. Her close proximity to Dominic afforded her privileges within the company that others envied, but it also placed her under constant scrutiny. Some co-workers resented her, while others simply watched with quiet curiosity, waiting to see if the whispers would turn into something more. As the rumors gained traction, Elise found herself increasingly isolated. Friends who once envied her life now seemed to pity her, offering sympathetic smiles and thinly veiled inquiries into how she was really doing. Elise hated it, the speculation, the doubt, the quiet judgment. But what she hated most was the possibility that it was all true. Her nights were spent replaying past conversations, searching for clues she might have missed. She wondered if she had been too trusting, too complacent in their marriage. In the privacy of their home, the distance between her and Dominic felt insurmountable. Conversations had become transactional, filled with logistics and pleasantries rather than the warmth and connection they once shared. Despite everything, Elise held on to hope. She told herself that every marriage had its ups and downs, that they would find their way back to each other. But deep inside, a part of her knew that things would never return to the way they were. As Dominic continued to immerse himself in work and his increasingly secretive life, Elise stood at a crossroads. Hold on to the illusion of a perfect marriage or confront the uncomfortable truth that was slowly unraveling before her eyes. She wasn't ready to face it just yet, but she could feel the weight of it pressing down on her. And then came the night everything changed. A late-night phone call, a suspicious glance, and the undeniable feeling that the perfect life she had worked so hard to maintain was slipping through her fingers. At first, the changes in Dominic were subtle, so subtle that Elise barely noticed them. She told herself that his long hours at the office were nothing new, that his exhaustion and distraction were just the natural side effects of his high-stress job. But over time, small things started adding up, tiny inconsistencies that chipped away at the perfect picture she had tried to hold on to. Dominic had always been dedicated to his work, but lately, it had consumed him in a way that felt different. He was spending more nights at the office, coming home later and later, and offering vague explanations when she asked about his schedule. "The board wants results," he'd say with a tired smile. "This project's going to make or break us." Elise wanted to believe him, but his words felt rehearsed, his tone distant. More troubling was his attachment to his phone. He had always been glued to it for work, but now it rarely left his hand. Even during the rare moments they spent together at home, he was constantly checking messages, stepping out to take calls in hushed tones, and turning the screen away when she glanced over. When she asked about it, he brushed it off casually. "Just work emails," he'd say, but there was something forced in his smile, something Elise couldn't quite place. Friends began to notice it too. One afternoon, over lunch with a mutual friend, Elise heard the first whisper of something she had been afraid of confronting. "I saw Dominic the other day," her friend mentioned, stirring her coffee absent-mindedly. "He was at that new Italian place downtown with Megan." Elise felt a sudden tightness in her chest but forced a laugh. "Oh, I'm sure it was just a business meeting," she said, waving it off. But deep down, a part of her knew better. The way her friend looked at her, with quiet concern behind her eyes, only deepened her unease. Over the next few weeks, Elise started noticing things she had previously ignored. Dominic's clothes smelled faintly of perfume that wasn't hers. His work shirts had been freshly pressed, even though she hadn't taken them to the cleaner. On more than one occasion, she found receipts from restaurants they had never been to together. She told herself there had to be a reasonable explanation, but doubt had started creeping into the edges of her mind. Meanwhile, Megan's fiancé, Robert Jameson, was also starting to notice the changes. Elise had always found Robert to be charming but slightly overbearing. He and Megan had been together for years, their relationship seemingly solid. But lately, Robert had been asking too many questions, about Megan's schedule, about the late nights, about Dominic. "He's always around," Robert had said once, when Elise bumped into him at the gym. "Megan says it's all work, but I don't know." He laughed, but it was a nervous laugh, one that made Elise uncomfortable. "If you ask me, he's got a little more than business on his mind." Robert's paranoia only fed Elise's own growing suspicions. She found herself watching Megan more closely at company events, studying the way she and Dominic interacted. Were they too comfortable with each other? Were their conversations too personal? Elise hated the way she was starting to doubt her husband, but the cracks were getting harder to ignore. Dominic, for his part, had grown increasingly erratic. He avoided eye contact whenever Elise brought up his late nights, his answers vague and dismissive. When she pressed him, he'd sigh in frustration, accusing her of not understanding the pressures he was under. "I don't need this right now, Liv," he'd say, rubbing his temples. "Work is stressful enough." But Elise couldn't shake the feeling that it wasn't just work that was weighing on him. He seemed restless even at home, pacing the living room late at night, taking long showers, and staring off into the distance more than usual. The easy intimacy they once shared had been replaced by a suffocating tension that neither of them acknowledged. Late one evening, as Elise lay in bed pretending to sleep, she heard Dominic in his study, his voice low and urgent over the phone. She couldn't make out the words, but his tone was unmistakably tense. When he finally came to bed, he lay stiffly beside her, staring at the ceiling for what felt like hours. Feeling isolated and unsure, Elise finally turned to her closest friend, Emily, during one of their regular lunches. At first, she tried to make it sound casual, but as the words tumbled out, she realized how much had been weighing on her. "Sometimes I feel like he's not really here anymore," Elise admitted, stirring her drink absently, "like his mind is somewhere else." Emily studied her carefully before speaking. "Liv, if you think something's going on, you need to talk to him. Really talk to him." Elise nodded, but deep down, she wasn't sure she wanted to know the truth. Despite her growing doubts, Elise continued to put on a brave face in public. She smiled at events, hosted dinner parties, and did her best to push aside the nagging feeling that something was very wrong. But the weight of suspicion was growing heavier with each passing day. Her nights became restless, spent tossing and turning, staring at the empty space beside her when Dominic worked late. She found herself scrolling through his social media, reading old messages between them, searching for some sign that things were still okay. But deep down, she knew things had changed. Dominic, once the devoted husband who couldn't wait to get home, now seemed like a stranger. And Elise was starting to wonder if she had ever really known him at all. Elise had spent weeks suppressing the nagging doubts that gnawed at her from the inside. She told herself that Dominic's long hours, the perfume on his clothes, and the hushed phone calls were all circumstantial, things she could explain away if she tried hard enough. But deep down, a part of her knew the truth. And one evening, it finally revealed itself in the most undeniable way. She hadn't meant to go through his emails. In fact, Elise prided herself on being the kind of wife who trusted her husband without question. But something about Dominic's behavior that day, his nervous glances, his hurried exit after dinner, had left her with an overwhelming urge to know. Sitting alone in their bedroom, Elise hesitated before opening his laptop, telling herself she was just looking for reassurance. Instead, what she found shattered her world. Buried beneath a pile of unread promotional emails was a hotel reservation confirmation, a suite booked at the Grand Lark Hotel, an upscale establishment Dominic often used for business meetings. But this wasn't a business reservation. The date was for the upcoming weekend, and Elise knew for a fact that no work trips had been scheduled. Her hands trembled as she clicked on the details, seeing it booked for 2 guests. There it was. Cold, undeniable proof of her worst fears. At first, Elise just sat there, staring at the screen, numb. She tried to tell herself there could be another explanation, that maybe it was an innocent coincidence. But deep down, she knew better. The pieces were falling into place, and she could no longer ignore them. That night, unable to sleep, Elise made a decision. She needed to see it for herself. If Dominic was lying to her, she had to catch him in the act. And so, 2 nights later, as he left the house dressed a little too sharply for a business dinner, Elise followed him. She trailed his car from a safe distance, her heart pounding as he pulled into the Grand Lark Hotel's valet area. Sitting in her car across the street, she watched him hand his keys over and stroll inside with a confidence that made her stomach turn. She didn't need to wait long before Megan Clark arrived. Elise watched as the young woman stepped out of a rideshare, her heels clicking against the pavement, her sleek dress leaving little to the imagination. The way Megan smiled at Dominic as they met in the lobby made Elise's chest tighten with rage. Something inside her snapped. She couldn't sit back and watch anymore. Elise stormed into the hotel lobby, her heels clicking with purpose against the marble floors. The front desk clerk barely had time to greet her before she spotted Dominic and Megan heading toward the elevators. Elise's voice cut through the elegant hum of the lobby. "Dominic!" He froze mid-step, his eyes widening as he turned to see Elise standing just a few feet away, fury burning in her gaze. Megan paled instantly, stepping away from Dominic, suddenly looking as though she wanted to disappear. The confrontation was immediate and raw. Elise's voice was low but filled with restrained anger, demanding to know how long it had been going on, why he had lied to her, how he could humiliate her like this. Dominic, ever the smooth talker, tried to downplay it, muttering excuses about late-night work meetings and misunderstandings. But Elise wasn't buying it, not anymore. Megan, caught in the middle, stammered out an apology, her eyes darting between them as she realized the affair was no longer a secret. Feeling cornered and ashamed, she muttered something about it being a mistake and bolted toward the exit, leaving Dominic alone to face Elise's wrath. The drive home was a blur. Elise's hands gripped the steering wheel so tightly her knuckles turned white. She felt humiliated, betrayed, and worst of all, completely lost. For years, she had devoted herself to their marriage, standing by Dominic through his long hours, supporting his ambitions, and maintaining their social image. And now, it all felt like a lie. In the following days, Elise withdrew from everything. Friends who called were met with silence, and social invitations went unanswered. She wasn't ready to talk about what had happened, not yet. The anger she had felt in the hotel lobby had simmered into something quieter but more dangerous. Robert Jameson, Megan's fiancé, found out soon enough. Whether it was from Megan herself or through the ever-churning corporate gossip mill, Elise wasn't sure. But one thing was clear. Robert was furious. His usual charm disappeared, replaced by cold, calculated resentment. Elise heard from mutual friends that he had been drinking more, making bitter remarks about betrayal, and throwing thinly veiled threats in Dominic's direction. Elise didn't care. In fact, a small part of her found satisfaction in knowing that Dominic wasn't the only one facing the consequences of his actions. But as days turned into weeks, Elise's demeanor changed. The vibrant, sociable woman who once hosted lavish dinner parties and charity events became a shadow of herself. She moved through life with quiet bitterness, showing up at social gatherings out of obligation, barely acknowledging the whispers around her. Friends noticed the change. Her cold, distant stares, the way she avoided talking about Dominic, and the way she seemed to carry a quiet, simmering rage beneath the surface. Even Dominic noticed. He had moved back into their home after promising Elise that he would end the affair for good, but the damage had been done. Their once warm and inviting home now felt like a battleground. Each conversation a loaded exchange, each glance heavy with resentment. Elise no longer asked where he was going, no longer waited up for him at night. And Dominic, sensing the shift, grew increasingly uneasy. Though Elise had yet to decide what she would do next, one thing was certain. She would never look at Dominic the same way again. The fallout from Dominic's affair spread through Elise's life like wildfire, touching every corner of her once perfect world. At first, she tried to maintain appearances, but cracks quickly formed, and soon, she couldn't hold them back. Friends noticed the change almost immediately. Elise, who once prided herself on her composure, was unraveling in front of their eyes. She started missing social events she had previously been the centerpiece of. Charity galas, luncheons, and neighborhood gatherings where she once effortlessly floated from conversation to conversation were now met with flimsy excuses or complete silence. When she did show up, Elise was a different person, quieter, distracted, and distant. Friends whispered about how she would stare off into space, drink a little too much wine, and disappear without saying goodbye. But it was Elise's public confrontations with Dominic that fueled speculation. Once known as a couple who kept their disagreements private, they were now the subject of hushed gossip. At a high-end restaurant, Elise was seen leaning across the table, her face tight with anger as she argued with Dominic in a low but furious tone. Witnesses recounted how Dominic had kept his voice calm, trying to defuse the situation, but Elise's pointed gestures and sharp whispers made it clear that things were far from okay. At a friend's dinner party, Elise had another outburst, this time when someone jokingly mentioned how much time Dominic had been spending at the office. She laughed bitterly and muttered under her breath, "Yeah, working overtime with his assistant," before abruptly leaving the table. Neighbors couldn't help but notice the tension brewing behind the Coopers' closed doors. Late at night, the sounds of heated arguments spilled out into the quiet suburban streets. Some neighbors, peeking through their windows, caught glimpses of Elise pacing their front yard in the early hours, cigarette in hand, muttering to herself. Others reported hearing loud shouting matches that ended with slammed doors and long silences. She was different, one neighbor later recalled. It was like she was carrying something heavy, and she couldn't keep it hidden anymore. The gossip took a new turn when Elise was seen entering the office of a well-known divorce attorney downtown. Paparazzi, who had started following her after whispers of the affair hit the tabloids, snapped photos of her walking out of the office, sunglasses on, lips pressed in a thin line. The headlines that followed speculated wildly: corporate VP's wife seeks divorce, and Elise Cooper ready to walk away? When confronted about the visit by an acquaintance, Elise brushed it off with a tight smile. "Just looking at my options," she had said vaguely, though her eyes told another story. Despite her casual dismissal, friends and the media latched onto the possibility that Elise was preparing to leave Dominic, and possibly take him for everything he was worth. As public sympathy poured in for Elise, she found herself in a strange position. She was no longer just the perfect wife in a perfect marriage. She had become a symbol of betrayal and resilience. Women approached her at events, offering sympathetic smiles and whispered words of support. But sympathy came with scrutiny, and the rumors about her erratic behavior began to surface in gossip columns and social media threads. Meanwhile, Meghan and Robert's relationship was also spiraling out of control. Robert, never one to handle betrayal well, was becoming increasingly unhinged. He started keeping closer tabs on Meghan's whereabouts, showing up at her workplace unannounced and scrolling through her phone whenever she left it unattended. Meghan's friends noticed the tension, watching as she grew more nervous and jumpy around him. One evening, Meghan confided in a friend that Robert had started tracking her movements, checking her car mileage, questioning her about her late nights, and even showing up at the gym to surprise her. "It's like he doesn't trust me at all anymore," she had said, her voice shaking. Robert's jealousy festered into something darker. He took to parking outside Dominic's office late at night, convinced that the affair was still ongoing despite Meghan's insistence that it was over. Elise, too, noticed his presence once, spotting his car idling near their house one evening as she returned from an event. The glare of his headlights in her rearview mirror sent a chill down her spine, and for the first time, she wondered if Robert might be more dangerous than she had initially thought. Despite everything, Dominic continued to downplay the situation, insisting that things would blow over with time. He told Elise that the media would move on to another scandal soon, and that they just needed to keep their heads down. But Elise wasn't convinced. She could feel the walls closing in and the weight of everything. Her public humiliation, her crumbling marriage, and the ever-present whispers was becoming too much to bear. Late one night, after another argument with Dominic that ended in slamming doors, Elise sat alone in their living room, staring at the framed wedding photos on the mantel. She traced her finger along the edges of their smiling faces, wondering how they had gotten to this point. In a moment of quiet despair, she muttered words that would later be repeated by those who overheard them. "I swear, I could do it to him for what he's done." Though she hadn't meant them literally, the sentiment lingered. Elise's friends noticed a colder, more detached version of her in the days that followed. Her once effortless charm was now laced with bitterness, and her smiles rarely reached her eyes. The growing tension between Dominic and Elise became impossible to ignore. Those around them could sense that something was building, something that wouldn't end quietly. And as Elise's behavior grew more unpredictable, so did the suspicions of those watching from the sidelines. The tension in Elise's life had become suffocating, pressing in from every direction. The affair wasn't just an ugly chapter in their marriage anymore. It had become public property, something dissected in whispers at charity events and speculated on in newspaper columns. Everywhere she went, she could feel eyes on her, judging, waiting to see how she would react. Dominic, Once the charming corporate executive who could smooth over any situation, was no longer the confident man he used to be. At work, his colleagues had begun to notice the cracks in his usually composed demeanor. He buried himself in meetings, barely speaking unless absolutely necessary. His once flawless presentations were now scattered with nervous pauses and half-hearted excuses. Despite his best efforts to carry on, the scandal followed him like a shadow. Clients were beginning to ask questions, and his superiors were losing patience with the negative publicity surrounding his personal life. The more pressure he felt, the more distant and erratic he became. At home, the distance between him and Elise grew wider with each passing day. He moved through the house like a ghost, avoiding eye contact and keeping their conversations brief and transactional. Elise rarely saw him for more than a few minutes at a time. He was either locked away in his home office, glued to his phone, or making excuses about late-night meetings. When they did speak, his voice was clipped and defensive, as if he was bracing himself for another confrontation. But Elise no longer had the energy for confrontations. She had withdrawn from her usual social circles, skipping luncheons and charity events where she once thrived. When she did attend, her presence was strained, her smiles forced. Friends who once admired her now looked at her with thinly veiled pity, offering awkward reassurances and empty platitudes. Elise hated it. She hated the sympathetic glances, the whispered gossip she wasn't supposed to hear, and the way people tiptoed around her like she was fragile. The sleepless nights weren't helping. She would often lie awake staring at the ceiling, her mind racing with thoughts she couldn't escape. To cope, she had turned to sleeping pills, first just a half dose here and there, but soon she found herself reaching for them more often, chasing them down with wine to quiet the thoughts that refused to leave her alone. The pills offered temporary relief, but in the mornings, she felt just as exhausted as the night before. Megan, on the other hand, had become a ghost of herself. Elise had seen her at the grocery store one afternoon, pale and anxious, glancing over her shoulder every few seconds. Megan's usual polished confidence was gone, replaced with a nervous energy that made Elise uncomfortable. She wasn't the only one who noticed it. Robert, Megan's fiancé, had started appearing more frequently, at work, at her gym, even outside the coffee shop Megan liked to visit. Robert's obsession had taken a darker turn. Elise had seen his car parked near their house more than once, idling just far enough down the street to avoid suspicion, but not far enough to go unnoticed. When their eyes met once through the window, he didn't look away. Instead, he stared at her with an intensity that sent a chill down her spine. Elise had told herself it was harmless, just a man nursing his bruised ego, but deep down, she wasn't so sure. Dominic had noticed it too. He had started locking the doors earlier, checking the security cameras more often, and keeping his phone even closer than before. When Elise asked him if he was worried about Robert, he shrugged it off, but she could see the tension in his jaw. She knew he was scared. Then there was the media. They followed her relentlessly, snapping photos whenever she left the house and publishing speculative headlines about what Elise might do next. Would she divorce Dominic? Would she forgive him? Was she hiding something? Every outing became an ordeal, every glance over her shoulder a reminder that she was being watched. She stopped going to the gym and started ordering groceries online just to avoid another encounter with a journalist. Despite her best efforts to keep things under control, Elise knew she was losing her grip. She found herself pacing the house late at night, wine glass in hand, staring out the window and watching the world move on without her. Sometimes, she wondered if she had the strength to keep going. Other times, she wondered what it would take to make everything stop. Dominic, in his own way, was spiraling too. He had grown increasingly paranoid, snapping at Elise over the smallest things and jumping at the sound of his phone ringing. He had taken to sleeping in the guest room, claiming it was to avoid waking her when he came home late. But Elise knew the truth. He didn't want to be near her. She wasn't sure if it was guilt, fear, or both. One night, Elise found herself standing outside the guest room door, listening to Dominic talk in hushed tones on the phone. She couldn't hear much, just fragments of words, handle it, not now, and I don't care anymore. Her heart pounded in her chest, and for the first time, she wondered if she really knew the man she had married. The pressure was building, and Elise could feel it pressing down on all of them. Dominic was on edge, Robert was becoming more unpredictable, and Megan was retreating further into herself. Even Elise had started to feel like a different person, one who was more bitter, more reckless, and less in control of her own life. She tried to tell herself that everything would settle eventually, that time would heal the wounds, but she knew better. The situation wasn't getting better. It was getting worse. Something was coming. She didn't know when, she didn't know how, but she could feel it. And deep down, she knew that none of them would come out of it unscathed. The tension inside the Cooper household had been building for weeks, and tonight, it finally exploded. What started as another passive-aggressive exchange over dinner turned into a full-blown argument that echoed through the walls of their suburban home. Elise, her face red with frustration, stood in the kitchen gripping the edge of the marble countertop while Dominic paced back and forth, his tie loosened and his shirt wrinkled. "I'm done with this, Elise," Dominic snapped, his voice low but filled with exhaustion. "I can't keep doing this." Elise's expression hardened. "Doing what, Dominic? Lying? Sneaking around?" Her voice wavered, but the bitterness cut through. "Or are you tired of pretending to care?" Neighbors would later say they heard everything. Shouting, accusations, and the unmistakable sound of glass shattering against the floor. No one intervened, though. They were used to the late-night fights, and by now, most had learned to tune it out. Behind closed doors, Elise and Dominic were at war, and the entire neighborhood had front-row seats. After a long silence, Elise grabbed her purse and stormed out, slamming the door behind her. Dominic didn't follow. He just stood there, rubbing his temples, staring blankly at the remnants of their broken marriage strewn across the kitchen floor. Outside, Elise's car peeled out of the driveway and disappeared down the quiet street. She drove aimlessly for a while, gripping the wheel so tightly that her knuckles turned white. Eventually, she pulled into a gas station on the edge of town, leaning against her car and staring at the empty road ahead. The security cameras above the pumps captured her standing there for nearly 20 minutes, just staring. Her mind raced with everything that had happened, everything that was still unraveling. When she finally left, she still didn't know where she was going, only that she couldn't go back home. Dominic, meanwhile, stayed at the house, sitting alone in the dimly lit living room. The television played on low volume, but he wasn't watching. His phone sat beside him, lighting up every few minutes with missed calls from Megan. He ignored them, swirling the half-empty glass of scotch in his hand, his thoughts tangled in regret and frustration. Megan had been trying to reach him all night. She sat curled up on her couch, staring at her phone, debating whether to call him again. The guilt was suffocating her, but she couldn't bring herself to face him. Instead, she silenced her phone, letting his calls go unanswered. She told herself it was for the best. Whatever they had been, was over. But deep down, Megan knew Dominic wasn't going to let go that easily. Elsewhere, Robert Jameson was watching. He had been tracking Megan's movements for weeks, showing up at places she frequented, always watching from a distance. That night, his car was seen parked near the Grand Lark Hotel, the same place where Dominic had been meeting Megan during their affair. He sat in the driver's seat, eyes fixed on the entrance, gripping the steering wheel tightly. Witnesses later recalled seeing a man matching his description standing outside, smoking a cigarette, his gaze locked on the lobby doors as if waiting for something, or someone. At the same time, Elise's absence from home didn't go unnoticed. A neighbor, out walking their dog, saw her car speeding away and noted the tense, tear-streaked expression on her face. The sight wasn't surprising anymore. Elise had been on edge for weeks, and tonight was just another chapter in their unraveling marriage. As the night dragged on, Dominic finally left the house, tossing his half-finished drink onto the kitchen counter before grabbing his keys. He drove straight to the hotel, his mind clouded with frustration and regret. He wasn't sure what he was looking for. Closure, maybe, or just someone to talk to. He didn't notice the car following him from a few blocks away, trailing his every turn. Meanwhile, Elise returned home in the early hours of the morning, exhausted and numb. She sat in the car for a long time, staring at the house that no longer felt like home. The lights were still on inside, but she didn't care. When she finally walked through the door, the silence felt heavier than usual. Dominic wasn't there. She didn't bother calling him. Instead, she went upstairs, poured herself another drink, and swallowed 2 sleeping pills, sinking into the bed that had once been shared but now felt emptier than ever. At work earlier that day, Dominic had been distant, distracted. His colleagues noticed how withdrawn he was, how absent-minded his responses had become. It wasn't the first time he'd seemed off, but today was different. He had barely looked up from his desk, his usual confident demeanor replaced with something much heavier. When a coworker asked if he was okay, he simply nodded and muttered something about having a lot on his mind. No one pushed further. Back at the hotel, Dominic checked in and made his way up to his usual room. The front desk staff had grown accustomed to seeing him, always with the same tired expression and distracted air. Tonight was no different. He swiped his keycard and stepped inside, exhaling heavily as he dropped his jacket on the bed. He pulled out his phone, staring at Megan's unanswered calls, but he didn't dial. Instead, he sank into the chair by the window, gazing out over the city lights, lost in thought. Megan, lying awake in her apartment, checked her phone one last time. A missed call from Dominic stared back at her. She sighed, hesitated for a moment, and then put the phone down without calling back. She would regret that decision later. The city moved on around them, unaware of the tension that simmered beneath the surface of their lives. The neighborhood lights flickered out one by one, the streets growing quieter. Elise finally drifted into a restless sleep. Dominic remained in his hotel room, lost in his thoughts. Megan curled up in bed, phone clutched tightly in her hand, and Robert sat in his car, watching. The morning after their explosive fight, Elise woke to an eerie silence. The house was empty, save for the dull hum of the refrigerator and the soft creak of the floorboards beneath her feet. Dominic hadn't come home, and for once, she didn't care. She poured herself a cup of coffee, staring out the kitchen window, her mind racing with the events of the previous night. She told herself she needed to move on, to let go, but something didn't feel right. There was a heaviness in the air she couldn't explain. Across town, at the Grand Lark Hotel, a housekeeper knocked on the door of room 412. When there was no response, she assumed the guest had already left, but something felt off. The Do Not Disturb sign hung crookedly, and a faint smell, stale alcohol and something sharper, lingered in the hallway. Hesitant, she unlocked the door and stepped inside. What she found sent a chill down her spine. Dominic was slumped in the chair by the window, still dressed in his clothes from the night before. An empty bottle of pills beside him and a glass half filled with amber liquid on the table. At first glance, it looked like an overdose. Another businessman who had drowned his sorrows in too much alcohol and medication. But the hotel staff had seen Dominic before, and something about the scene didn't sit right. His phone was missing, his watch was gone, and there was a faint bruise around his neck, barely visible but enough to raise questions. By the time the police arrived, the scene was swarming with hotel management and curious onlookers whispering about what had happened to the man in room 412. Officers cordoned off the area, pushing back bystanders while crime scene investigators combed through every inch of the room. It didn't take long for them to determine that Dominic's death wasn't as straightforward as it seemed. The news spread quickly. Within hours, headlines splashed across the internet. Corporate VP found dead in luxury hotel, and speculation ran wild. At first, reports leaned toward an accidental overdose, citing Dominic's recent public struggles and the pressures of his high-profile job. But soon, whispers of something darker began to circulate, and all eyes turned to Elise. Her behavior in the days leading up to Dominic's death had been erratic, to say the least. Friends recalled heated arguments, her public outbursts, and the way she had withdrawn from social events. The fact that she had left their home late at night after their fight only added to the speculation. Security footage from a nearby gas station showed Elise alone in her car, looking visibly distressed just hours before Dominic was found dead. When detectives arrived at the Cooper house to speak with her, Elise was composed but distant. Her answers were vague, her timeline unclear. "I drove around for a while," she told them. "I just needed to clear my head." But when asked where exactly she had gone, she hesitated. It was that hesitation that fueled the growing suspicion around her. Dominic's colleagues were quick to add fuel to the fire. They described his recent state of mind, how distracted and withdrawn he had been at work. Some even hinted that he had mentioned feeling unsafe at home, though no one could recall specifics. He was under a lot of pressure, one coworker said. I think Elise, she wasn't handling things well. But Elise wasn't the only suspect. Robert Jameson's name quickly entered the conversation. The hotel's security cameras had captured his car circling the area the night of Dominic's death, and his obsession with Megan hadn't gone unnoticed. Investigators learned that he had confronted Dominic weeks before, accusing him of ruining his life, and witnesses described how his temper had grown increasingly volatile. When police questioned Robert, his alibi was shaky at best. He claimed he had just been driving around, trying to clear his head, but Megan, already distancing herself from the whole ordeal, refused to vouch for him. She was shaken, avoiding reporters and declining all interview requests. Those closest to her whispered that she was hiding something, that her last conversation with Dominic had been far more emotional than she let on. As the investigation dragged on, Elise found herself at the center of a media storm. The narrative quickly shifted from a grieving widow to a vengeful wife. Tabloids ran stories about her erratic behavior, citing anonymous sources who claimed she had been overheard saying she wanted to make Dominic pay for what he'd done. Old friends began to question whether they ever really knew her. Despite the speculation, Elise maintained her innocence. I loved my husband, she said in a carefully rehearsed statement to the press. Whatever problems we had, I would never hurt him. But the public wasn't so sure. Investigators worked tirelessly to separate fact from fiction, combing through financial records, phone logs, and security footage. Elise's lawyer insisted she had nothing to hide, but her refusal to answer certain questions only made detectives more determined. A search of the Cooper home revealed nothing incriminating, but the inconsistencies in Elise's statements were hard to ignore. Meanwhile, Megan remained on edge, dodging the press and avoiding Dominic's funeral altogether. When detectives pressed her for more information, she became evasive, claiming she hadn't spoken to him the night he died. But phone records painted a different picture. There were several missed calls from Dominic to Megan just hours before his death. What was he trying to tell her? As the days passed, the pressure mounted. Elise found herself increasingly isolated, hounded by reporters and abandoned by friends who no longer wanted to be associated with the scandal. Her once loyal circle now kept their distance, afraid of being dragged into the mess. Even those who once defended her were starting to have doubts. A former friend confided to a reporter she changed after the affair came out. It was like she was holding on to something. Anger, resentment. I don't know what she was capable of. Detectives continued to dig deeper, determined to find the truth. But with Elise's erratic behavior, Robert's obsessive tendencies, and Megan's reluctance to talk, the lines between guilt and innocence were becoming increasingly blurred. As the case unfolded, one thing became clear. Dominic's death was no accident, and the real truth was far closer than anyone realized. As the investigation stretched on, the scrutiny surrounding Elise only intensified. The media painted her as a scorned wife pushed too far, and despite the lack of concrete evidence, public opinion had already turned against her. Friends distanced themselves, whispers followed her everywhere, and even those who once stood by her began to doubt. But beneath the surface, investigators were beginning to question their own assumptions. Something wasn't adding up. Elise's timeline was shaky, but there were no traces of her DNA or fingerprints in the hotel room. And then there was the matter of Dominic's missing phone and watch, items Elise had no reason to take. It was a forensic analyst who first noticed the odd detail, a faint trace of a perfume found on Dominic's shirt collar that didn't match anything Elise owned. It was subtle, almost undetectable, but enough to make detectives take a closer look at everyone in Dominic's life. That's when Rachel Walker's name resurfaced. Rachel had been Elise's neighbor and a longtime friend of the Coopers. She was always around, offering support, lending a sympathetic ear, and showing up at the right moments. Elise had never suspected anything of her. Why would she? But as investigators dug into Rachel's background, a different picture began to emerge. Rachel had always admired Dominic, sometimes too much. She had been seen at corporate events where she had no real reason to be, volunteering at charity functions Elise hosted just to be closer to him. Friends recalled how Rachel often spoke about Dominic in ways that felt off. At the time, Elise dismissed it as harmless admiration, but detectives now saw it as something more: obsession. A deeper dive into surveillance footage from Rachel's home provided the breakthrough they needed. Footage from the night of Dominic's death showed Rachel leaving her house at a suspiciously late hour, wearing what appeared to be a dark hoodie and sunglasses. She was gone for over an hour before returning, looking anxious and hurried. Further analysis revealed something even more damning. Rachel had been in possession of Elise's spare keycard, the very one used to access Dominic's hotel room. Investigators determined that Rachel had stolen it weeks earlier, likely during one of her visits to Elise's home when tensions were high, and no one would have noticed such a small item going missing. With this new evidence, detectives built a chilling timeline of what really happened that night. Rachel, consumed by jealousy and resentment, had used the stolen keycard to enter Dominic's hotel room. She brought sedatives with her, likely slipping them into his drink before suffocating him once he was incapacitated. The missing phone and watch? Rachel had taken them to stage a robbery, ensuring suspicion would fall on Elise or even Robert, who had been lurking nearby that night. When confronted with the evidence, Rachel initially denied everything. She claimed the footage was misleading, that she had simply gone out for a walk, but the mounting proof was undeniable. Eventually, under pressure, Rachel's carefully crafted facade began to crack. She confessed, not in a dramatic outburst, but in a quiet, calculated admission. She had loved Dominic, she said, in a way Elise never could. He deserved better than Elise's constant nagging and cold demeanor. In Rachel's mind, she was rescuing him from a miserable life, but when he rejected her advances, she saw only one way out. If she couldn't have him, no one could. And framing Elise? That was just the final touch, a way to punish the woman she had always envied. Elise was finally cleared of suspicion, but the damage was done. The headlines didn't celebrate her innocence the way they had vilified her guilt. Instead, she was left with the remnants of a ruined reputation, forced to pick up the pieces of a life she no longer recognized. Megan, now free from Robert's obsessive control, tried to distance herself from the entire ordeal, quietly leaving town to start over. Robert, though initially under scrutiny, was eventually cleared but remained forever tied to the tragic story. As for Rachel, her arrest sent shockwaves through the community. No one could believe that the seemingly kind and helpful neighbor, always ready with a smile and a kind word, had been capable of such a cold, calculated act. It was a stark reminder of how deeply obsession and jealousy could drive someone to unimaginable lengths. In the end, Dominic's death wasn't about love or betrayal. It was about control, and Rachel had spent years living in the shadow of a life she thought she deserved. Now, behind bars, she would have plenty of time to reflect on just how far she had fallen. For Elise, the ordeal was far from over. Though she had been cleared of the crime, the scars it left behind were permanent. The trust she once had in those around her was gone, replaced with a lingering sense of unease and betrayal. She had lost more than a husband. She had lost herself in the process. As she stood in the empty house, looking out at the quiet street where Rachel once lived, Elise realized that some wounds never truly heal.